It's rare that I get to talk about a show that has almost universal praise, and that I also happen to not find utterly repulsive. The thick of it has perhaps fallen from a lot of people's minds. You don't see as many people say, this is just like the thick of it, whenever the government has an exceptionally farcical moment. Though, part of that might be that farcical describes a day ending in Y for a lot of British governments that we've had recently. I made a passing reference to it in my video about peep shows, since these shows were contemporaneous and, to me, broadly represented similar political expression. What I said at the time was that Peep Show has a lasting legacy because it was much less of an explicit grandstand on politics, whereas The Thick of It is very much a naked political satire. In that video, I said that The Thick of It had taken on the character of a victory lap for the kind of politics it was trying to satirize, because Armando Iannucci, the creator of the show, who you will most likely know as the guy who did Death of Stalin, or if you're American, Veep, had gone on to align with the very people he was satirizing here, as did some of the other people involved in the show, from writers to actors to pretty much everyone in between. I still think that's a valid reading of The Thick of It, but it's incomplete, especially when you consider how strong a legacy it's left with a particular type of person, a kind of lowercase p political character who I maybe unfairly characterize as the kind of person who thinks listening to James O'Brien is enough politics for the day. Or the kind of person who buys you a Christmas present and it's a book by a centrist because you like politics, right? I'm not trying to be cruel in my description here, but The Thick of It really does seem to disproportionately be treated as a masterpiece by people who aren't really invested in solving the problems, and we'll get to that later on. I'm pretty sure we will anyway. My point is, it's considered very influential. In fact, if you've ever heard the term omnishambles in a political context, this show is where that comes from, and it's generally regarded as a very good show across a lot of boundaries, and that makes it worth exploring. In order to understand The Thick of It, we need to understand the political moment it was created in. The show ran from 2005 to 2012, so we're talking about a period that's post-Blairite peak, from the Iraq War into the coalition government. If I could characterize this time period, I would say it's a period where politics is dominated by PR, spin, and press perception having an outsized influence over politicians' fortunes. All of this is downstream from the professionalization of the Labour Party, particularly its political communications. After such a long time in opposition, Labour had decided not only that it needed to moderate its policy offerings through the ideological expression we would now call Blairism, they also sought to master the art of spin and maintain what I would characterize as inappropriate relationships with journalists. Now, just to be very clear, I'm not making that kind of accusation that comes with the word inappropriate. I just mean it in the plainest sense, that it is not appropriate for press officers, spin doctors, and politicians to maintain close relationships with the people who are supposed to be scrutinizing them. It's a mutually degrading practice that blurs the lines between two groups of people who should have conflicting objectives. This is also the process by which you end up with Alistair Campbell, a man regularly accused of being a bully, probable war criminal, and now podcaster, sitting alongside another probable war criminal who centrists love, being an influential figure in British politics. He's also the obvious source of inspiration for Malcolm Tucker. Hey all, Editing SK here, making a rare intervention. I am aware that people associated with The Thick of It have denied that Alistair Campbell was the inspiration for Malcolm Tucker, but it's also so obviously the case that Alistair Campbell represents the kind of figure that Malcolm Tucker is intended to satirize that I feel like you can functionally say that this is the case, and that's fine. But I understand if people don't think that, but I just wanted to make that clear that I was aware of that, and that I'm still pretty comfortable with what I said here. So yeah, that's it. Editing SK out. It's also how you end up with Peter Mandelson appearing to essentially run the Labour Party, no matter what its members or the electorate think of that. His career was basically launched by being Director of Communications for Neil Kinnock, who kick-started this long process that Blair finished. Both by choice of target and by when it was made, this is the perfect Blairite satire, including by expanding the show to include the opposition, who are very obviously the Tory party, who followed in Blair's footsteps in an effort to level the playing field after their own time in the wilderness. In that sense, this is an examination of the one enduring legacy of Blair. A lot of the problems we have now in the UK exist because of the things pointed at by the thick of it. It's fashionable sometimes to say that Blair left no significant legislative legacy because any domestic reforms were undone almost instantly by the coalition government, aside from his draconian anti-terror legislation, which laid the foundation that means peaceful protesters can just be arrested for holding a sign. In reality, this situation where the press perception is what dominates politics, where certain newspapers have got it into their heads that they can make and unmake prime ministers, is the natural conclusion of both major parties professionalizing their comms. Imagine massive quotes around professionalizing, by the way. So I guess thanks, Tony. Your only legacy isn't just being a war criminal, it's also given the worst people in Britain a veto on whether we get to have nice things or not. Cheers, mate. On the show itself, I actually rewatched it recently and I quite enjoyed it, with certain caveats that we'll get to, but overall, my fond memories of it were aligned with what it was like watching it again. There is something enjoyable about the show, particularly Malcolm Tucker, played by Peter Capaldi, who seems to be delighting in playing the worst colleague in history. Really, the cast as a whole is pretty good, aside from the guy who plays Hugh in the first two seasons, given the things he was convicted of, which I'm sure I'll put up on screen in some fashion, but we'll leave it there for now. But it does make watching those first two seasons more difficult, and it is a shame because I feel like the Hugh-Malcolm dynamic is the better of the two ministers on the Labour side. That's not to say that Nicola Murray has nothing going for her, but the show does take on a different, and I would say crueler dynamic that's not as entertaining, just because Nicola Murray is played as this extremely soft target, since she's so obviously out of her depth and totally unsuitable for the role that she's placed in. It's almost like there's no sport in it, because she's like shooting fish in a barrel for Malcolm, so he can just unleash onto her. It's clear what part of the political machine every character represents, and what the show is trying to do by having them usually implode upon meeting reality. All of this led me to the obvious question that forms the backbone of this video. Does the thick of it hold up? Now, there's a very short version of this video where I point out the use of homophobia, the repeated use of an ableist slur, and just the varied stigmatizing language used about mental health to say no. On that basis, it doesn't hold up because it's a product of being a British comedy in the 2000s and was downstream of this moment in the 90s where British comedians seem to have decided that Britain had resolved the issues of bigotry by deciding it was bad so they could engage in ironic bigotry. Now, in the case of the thick of it, the characters are not people we're meant to be rooting for. They are by and large quite terrible people behaving terribly. So it is different to say Little Britain, which I did that video about, in that it is actually trying to be a satire, and there is at least enough ambiguity about who we're supposed to be siding with throughout that you could argue the case that these things are meant to highlight how reprehensible and petty the people who govern us are. I'm actually not sure I buy that in its entirety, but it is at least arguable. Instead, I think the problem is actually much more fundamental than the language. As we'll see, even if we consider anything that happened after 2012 when the show's run came to an end as inadmissible, there are still issues, and it actually reflects a particular kind of political outlook and character. One who is able to identify the problems and even condemn the causes of it, but in such a way that they can refuse to do anything or act in a way that would change it. First, let's get into what the show believes the problem is. Returning to that professionalization of political comms I talked about earlier, there were, it turns out, some consequences for both major political parties going down that path. By virtue of how large those parties were, they're not so large anymore, they moved the centre of gravity of British politics in an almost irreversible way. What happened is that politics, particularly politics associated with projects that seek to govern, through that period and beyond, have had to focus less on, does this policy produce a desirable outcome, which you would think is the main point of any kind of politics. Instead, now the question is, how will this be received in the press? It's why you get spectacles like the government being forced, after digging in their heels, to U-turn on a policy. Because U-turning is seen as more damaging than following through on an unpopular or bad policy. It would show weakness and leave you even more exposed to the press than you already are. The net effect is to turn politics from an exercise in how to improve lives or just produce your desired outcome, even if it's not to improve lives, I suppose. I guess that's bad, but it's also the way I describe like 75% of political actors in the UK. So I guess we have to sort of accept that. But it turns all of that into an exercise in PR, where the press perception holds such leverage over not just the government but the opposition and other political forces that they can't deviate from it without risking being denied the means to communicate their positions clearly. However we may feel about this, and I suspect you also think it's bad, especially if you like the thick of it, this is a prime recipe for farce. The new Labour government had a series of scandals that were utterly ridiculous. Data losses, awkward encounters with the public, all of the stuff in the show, really, which is treated with the seriousness it deserves. It is plainly a farce, and honestly, if you could pick a single word to describe British governance over the past 30 plus years, farce is quite high up there. It's in the top 5, certainly. It's also why the show, despite being pretty obvious about who the two parties are in the show, can get away with depicting both as not especially ideological, because that's all the press's job and the spin doctor's job. Hugh, Nicola, Peter Mannion on the Tory side, none of these people have to believe anything or be anything. They just have to deliver the lines, even if they viscerally disagree with them, as does happen across the series. There's a really telling clip where Hugh is being made to back a policy he hates, and he fantasizes about standing up for himself, and then just doesn't.
I'm going to take a fucking stand on this one, and buggered if I'm going to let you down now. I'm going to go into the PM, and I'm going to tell him straight up, this bill is a load of old bollocks.
No, you're not.
No, I'm not, but it would be great if I did, wouldn't it?
The targets of the thick of it are quite clear. First is the process by which the new Labour and later the coalition government engaged with the press and how that impacted their policy making. Then it focuses on the specific public figures, like Malcolm Tucker, obviously being Alistair Campbell, and Stuart Pearson, the Tory equivalent, being, I forget the name, but I'm 100% sure David Cameron had a guy who did this sort of corporate well-being HR style shit for him as part of this whole softening the Tory brand that he had going on. This is a good time to point out that while the show never explicitly names the parties it depicts, it's very obvious that the government at the start is clearly a new Labour one. The opposition that goes on to form a coalition are a kind of Cameronite Tory party, and their junior coalition partners are the Lib Dems. So I will just call them by name, even though the show doesn't. It also picks on the people who facilitated these shifts and processes in British politics. the special advisors, the civil servants, and the politicians themselves, who in the show have these semi-regular moments of clarity where, through being personally annoyed or inconvenienced or on the verge of having their careers destroyed, realize how pointless it is to do everything this way. Not that it ever really goes anywhere, constrained as the show is by its intended format, especially in the earlier seasons. To focus on the New Labour government's portrayal in the series, it's fair to say that it's relatively non-ideological aside from some of the political instincts on display. Really what it's trying to do is make things work using duct tape. Or, it's kind of like that flex tape advert meme, but it's always good comms that solve the problem. The whole point, and I think what the show is getting at, both in New Labour and coalition eras, but particularly with the former, is that the aim was not to make things work or be good, but to make them superficially appear as if they were working, especially in the wake of what Thatcher and John Major did to the UK, because politics had become non-ideological and an exercise in PR. All you could do was make Thatcherism look like it functioned, which a lot of people will say the Blair government accomplished. Not to repeat myself, but if it was so good, how come the gains were wiped out by both the 2008 financial crisis and the first 18 months of the coalition government? I know that a lot of people my age and older are relishing that the time that they were kids and teenagers is now the nostalgia zone, but let's not pretend this shite ever worked. I was there. It was bleak as fuck. Maybe not as bleak as it is now, but it was still pretty bleak. The primary form the show takes is that of a workplace comedy, where most of the action takes place either in the department, which is eventually named DOSAC, or on the way to and from official engagements, or sometimes even in Number 10 itself. So a lot of the underlying humour is that of workplace boundaries being crossed, but with a party political layer imposed on it. Not to spoil too much of my thoughts that'll come later, but this show can really only work with these characters in this kind of setting. In that way, it's kind of the opposite of how I feel about Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which is a cop show, but those characters could work in basically any other profession and it'd still be pretty funny. With the thick of it, if this was just, as an example, a normal corporate office and you had a guy like Malcolm stalking the place and screaming at people, it'd suddenly take on a very different tone, which in itself feels like the show is commenting on a lot of things, but I would gesture towards how politics being like this selects for absolutely awful people, something we are reaping the consequences of right now. The way the show gets away with this, with having such a brazen bully like Malcolm, is one, seeing him vent his frustrations is kind of cathartic, both because of the specific incompetence he's confronted by, which can become a little unbearable, and because the targets of his ire are often politicians, special advisors, and civil servants. Not to rub any salt in any wounds, but these are not usually people who are generally popular or well-liked by anyone really, so they're kind of a cheap and easy target, which works wonders for this show because it means you can really push how awkward and terrible you make it for them, which elevates the whole affair. One thing I will say is that while the scenarios are exaggerated, they are strangely and perhaps rather depressingly in 2026 a little believable, even if some of them push hard at the edges of that. On that note, I'm going to do what I did in the Little Britain video. I'm going to walk us through an episode so we're absolutely on top of how a regular, typical episode of this show looks and how it tries to hit its targets. Okay, so we're going to do a similar thing to what I did for the Little Britain video, only instead of deliberately seeking out the highest rated episodes on IMDb, because I was arguing from an antagonistic perspective in that video, I decided to try to find the most average episode, since this is a show I quite like. What I did was I found the average episode rating on IMDb, which was 8.1 at the time, and what I could have done is I could have worked out the standard deviation of the ratings and a bunch of other stuff, but I couldn't be fucked. So what I did was put every episode that was rated between 7.9 and 8.3 into a list on the basis that that would likely be good enough to get a cross-section of episodes across all 4 seasons. I then spun the Wheel of Pain, and it landed on Series 4, Episode 3, which will be our case study for today. Now, this episode is part of the final season of the show, which has a much more serialized story than the earlier ones, and is set after the coalition government came into power. So we have a swap in our roles here. Labour are in opposition in this series, and the Tories, alongside their extremely little brother energy coalition partners, the Lib Dems, are the ones in government. This episode focuses exclusively on the coalition government, which means that the most iconic character produced by the series in Malcolm Tucker isn't present. That being said, it's an episode that does still have the key components of the series in it, and it's a show that's clearly evolved as events transpired, and it found its identity as all shows do. I will say that I didn't necessarily like this episode all the way through. I actually kind of low-key found it a bit boring, which is a nothing criticism, so don't focus too much on it. But that's why we spun the wheel, to try to find something I could talk about beyond I think it's really good. So well done to the wheel, a 100% success record for that idea. I'll just say, in case you skipped the first section, that what I said about there being elements across the show that absolutely mean it does not hold up is true of this episode. Just, hold on, let me get them. So just looking at my notes, we can see slurs. So yeah, like, if your answer to the question that's the title of this video is no on that basis alone, I understand and agree. We're just going to have to go a little further here and look at the foundations of it. This episode picks up on a thread that emerged in previous episodes, namely that the department headed by Peter Mannion has sold a nurse's state-provided flat, which, I'm going to be real with you, not a thing I remember being at all real, but I might have just been a child at the time. And he's protesting the government by camping out since they've made him homeless, which naturally, this being a British government, means they're simultaneously very annoyed, but also just kind of like itching to unleash the full force of the state to make this guy go away. That is the problem rumbling in the background of our 2 main plots here. One is people coming into work on a bank holiday, either to mind the shop or to sneakily do some party political business in the background without their coalition partners noticing, which introduces an outsider into what's quite a dysfunctional arrangement within the department. The other is Peter Mannion being sent away to what I could only describe as the worst away day I could possibly imagine. Stuart is this very annoying corporate bullshit guy with a nasty edge, and I won't lie, I almost prefer the idea of being shouted at by Malcolm over having to put up with this shit. Peter Mannion is here because he's being punished by the Prime Minister, and it has a kind of bullying tone to it at times, but largely it just seems annoying and shit. Now, I'm not a person who by instinct bashes hippies or things associated with them, but I think Mannion kind of nails it in this quote as a summary of the entire away day prior to the big crisis hitting.
Some of us had to go through this hippie shit the first time around.
The 2 colliding elements here are the Lib Dems having an economist over to pitch a policy that on reflection seems kind of okay, but honestly compared to the coalition's actual policies is practically utopian. The point is, this is probably one of the rare instances where the outcome of a policy is actually being seriously weighed up and discussed on camera. Now, they do recoil when they hear the initial cost, and obviously this being an austerity government led by the Tories, spending money is illegal, basically. All that being said, it's interesting to see some actual policy and politics happen in the show that isn't purely personal pettiness or bullying or screaming at the press or being screamed at by the press. There's a lot of screaming in this show, and some of it even happens in this episode, actually. The nurse they're trying to evict turns out to be dead and has been driven to suicide by the government, which triggers a cascading series of panics because the away day Mannion is on has banned phones and doesn't have any signal, which leads to him and Stuart to go on a children's slide in order to get a signal and get up to date. An image that later comes back to bite him in the department. There are two major moments of clarity in this episode. One is Glenn absolutely losing his cool and basically admitting what the government did in a way that's too awkward for the Lib Dems to deal with, given they have an economist over and they're worried she'll say something to someone and that'll become a press story. Which leads us to the Lib Dems buying the £2 billion bank out of what Mannion calls social embarrassment. It's a great example of perception driving policy, more than whether it's good or not, especially when you see Mannion's rant.
The triple. I'm a nurse killer, a banker, and now I'm raising fucking taxes!
The other moment of clarity comes from Mannion before this. In the, I want to say like they call this the idea zone or something. It's really weird. It's some kind of bullshit that I can't stand, with the notion that it's a good idea to get rid of Stuart. That he's not necessary, and that even the PM is realizing this, which is why he's putting people through these weird away days. This particular moment of clarity repeats, where often the politicians who are subjected to them wonder why they need these heads of their press operations, and openly question whether it's worth it or actually leading to anything good. Suffice to say, everything degenerates into a farce. And there's even a moment after the worst of it has hit and they've sent out the Lib Dems to deal with the problem, where Mannion says plainly that they're the kind of politician that makes people hate politicians. A shocking act of self-awareness there. Mannion's anger and resignation to this being how things are really does reflect how more and more of the public have gone on to feel about this after prolonged contact with this mode of doing politics. I don't think this was an intentional commentary, but the thing that connects all the politicians is that through having the closest contact with it, they've all been ground down, which, apart from a few moments in the past couple of decades, has really been a feature of British politics. People are just fucking tired of it. Another thing captured well in this episode is, partially because this is a more serialized bit of the show, but also they manage it in this one episode, is a sense of permanent and all-encompassing crisis. They can't even have a bank holiday without needing to pull people in and facing a full-blown disaster, including the minister being photographed in a children's playground. I say that like there are adult, I guess there might be adult playgrounds, I don't know. In a way, that's something that still rings true in this series. Like, you could easily see Keir Starmer's own operation collapsing under the weight of how farcical it is, like Mannion's does, which is why I'm always a bit surprised we don't see more of It's Just Like the Thick of It, though I will concede I do run some pretty comprehensive mute lists, so it might be going on without me seeing it. Have to sort of accept that as a possibility. Overall, though, a good episode as a case study, but not my favorite. It wasn't unpleasant. It was just kind of middle of the road for the show, and it couldn't hope to live up to the version of it that probably existed in my head. All of this brings me back to the big question. Does it hold up? We should start from, what are we laughing at or with? Are we laughing with Malcolm's abusive tirades, or the weird, slightly bigoted banter-style humour between the characters? Or are we supposed to look at them as horrible people who are doing horrible things, just in a political setting where that seeps into other areas and just produces bad, but sometimes hilarious, outcomes? I think if we set aside the elements of this that are rooted in this particular moment in British comedy, which I've talked about elsewhere and really deserves its own video, given how often I have to address that point whenever I talk about a British comedy from this time period. What we see is that all of the characters across the entire show's run are pretty much terrible. Malcolm's a workplace bully, Hugh is a spineless worm, Ollie is a second-generation Blairite who can't behave professionally, Terry's kind of alright, but she's a creature of the institution to which she belongs and does the wrong thing over and over again. Glenn has this moment in the case study episode where he's painted as the last decent person in that department, which is odd considering how he behaves for a lot of the show's run. He is pretty terrible as well. He's not exempt. So when we see Malcolm shout at someone or go to bully a journalist or talk casually about shouting, we're usually talking about someone who is bad getting it in the neck. The problem isn't the characters and whether they're terrible, but the structure they're put in. Because this has the fundamentals of a workplace sitcom. It is constrained somewhat by the need to bring everything back to an equitable status quo. Almost every episode ends with consequences, but they're almost always left behind in the previous episode. The case study episode earlier happened to be an exception, but most of the show's peak, as I would define it, sort of season 2-ish, maybe season 3 as well, occurs with this dynamic. So yes, they are terrible, but they almost all bounce back for the sake of the show's format. Also, the political lens applied to it reads to me as if it wasn't for the personal dysfunction of the bad people, this broad approach to politics would produce good outcomes. I said earlier that I had mentioned that this show had a feeling of being a victory lap for this kind of politics. And I think on reflection, when I made that argument, or at least the version of the argument I was making, I was arguing in a post hoc way. It is there though, just imposed on it because of the structure, and in that sense you struggle to see how it could hold up. The thick of it isn't always sunny. It's not even Peep Show. The character's fundamental awfulness isn't centered enough to feel like a credible excuse for how far the characters go. Like, we have a scene where Malcolm bares his soul, and it's hard not to read this as a scene where we're supposed to be sympathetic to him. We actually get a look at Malcolm's house, and when you compare it to how the second generation Blairites in both the Tories and Labour live, I mean, again, it's hard not to see this terrible person who gets to live a life that his subordinates can only aspire to. It's a really good summary of how Blairism as an ideology ended up playing out. Gen X and Boomer Blairites reaping benefits while their children have to make do with less. But I keep coming back to, what are we supposed to find funny here? And often it is just the severity of the swearing or the unpleasant language, which, yes, is an important component of why this method of governing or doing politics doesn't work or produce good outcomes. But the spectacle takes over as the show progresses, which is why, even though it first broadcast in 2005, the earliest episodes feel more timeless. The focus is very much on the negative impacts of having a Malcolm or a press-obsessed leadership in power colliding with a system of government that's primed to produce silos and dysfunction. Yes, Malcolm is still a bully. Yes, Malcolm swears a bunch, but it feels more focused on the subject matter. In fact, if I'm recalling correctly, it might even have less of the worst aspects of the show in terms of content. It's still very much a 2000s British comedy, but it's possibly due to the subject matter a bit more muted in it. Then it seems to decide that its identity is vulgarity and just allowing the characters to be awful while still trending them towards a functional status quo. Good example of this is the episode with the woman who asks Hugh if he's ever cleaned up his own mother's piss, and it becomes a minister looks a tit situation, and there's a whole flip-flopping press operation that tries to throw him under the bus or variously save him. Glenn acts in such an outrageous way that it ought to have been the end of his career, and possibly the end of Hugh's career, to be honest. Yet there he is, all the way until season 4, a survivor despite this. To say nothing of how much it becomes about personal unpleasantness when Nicola Murray comes onto the scene, who seems to solely exist as a soft target for Malcolm, and someone so hapless you wonder how they even became an MP. Like, even Keir Starmer would not defend her as a high-quality candidate. This becomes the focus instead of what I think the critique is meant to be, though I do think Peter Mannion is a great addition, not just because of the performance, but because it's a great idea to bring in the opposition or the coalition government, who are following in the government's footsteps, the new Labour government's footsteps, to demonstrate how Cameron's political project was also transparently insincere, especially when Mannion talks about what their leader and his clique are really like. All that softening of the Tories' image was obvious bullshit and was bullshit at the time, and yet the country fell for it. And look where that took us, honestly. Does it hold up? I'm afraid even if we discount all of the environmental factors, I find it hard to say it does. Partially because it does read as a victory lap, even without the post hoc justification, and because it is the perfect encapsulation of how a Guardian reader understands politics. The thick of it is perfectly capable, and even quite good, at pointing to where the problems are. It's rooted in a politics concerned with style over substance, with perception over outcome. But it rejects its own analysis and pivots to producing something that, instead of unambiguously condemning, wishes that its subjects could be better. You can't help but notice a yearning in the episodes for Malcolm to turn a corner, even as he descends into full-on betrayal, or for Hugh to finally stand up for himself, or for Nicola to get it together, or for Peter Mannion to realise that he doesn't have to do this, or just for any of the characters to get a fucking life, you know? In that yearning that it develops over time, it feels like it pulls its punches on the system and instead focuses more on the individuals, which is another way it doesn't hold up as some amazing cutting political satire. It can't see the structure it's operating within. It's the kind of satire that has the appearance of a clear-eyed critique and incisive commentary, but without obligating anyone to actually think too hard about it, much less take anyone who offers solutions to it seriously. That's not to say it's a bad show that says nothing, it says plenty. Just look at the runtime of the video. And it takes some pretty good shots at public figures and parties that had it coming. It's plenty entertaining and funny. It's just not what people remember it being. There's a lot to like about what it is, there's also a lot to recoil from. I won't do the trite land of contrast thing, but I believe compared to the standards set by its biggest advocates, it falls short. It doesn't hold up. So, I need to thank my proofreader, who did a fantastic job reading this. Any mistakes are purely my mistake, they're nothing to do with her. I also need to say, if you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, subscribe, all of the good stuff. And if you really enjoyed the video, all the videos we've done recently, you should join the Patreon or the members program, but particularly the Patreon, because there is a discount code, SK32YO. Guess why that is. That code is valid until midnight after my birthday. So, you know, the clock is ticking. It's not long. It's not long now until my birthday, actually. And you can join the Patreon or the membership programs to vote on the topic of videos. You get early access to the videos. You get to see outlines of the scripts, early drafts of the scripts. There's a Discord. There's all sorts of stuff, all sorts of really cool stuff. And if you're a top tier patron or a YouTube member, you get a shout out like these lovely people: Drone Riff, Kersley Scheider, John N, Liron, Jar Jar, Mubar, and Carolyn. Thank you to them. And to the YouTube members, Nadi Jiwa, Katie Marshall, Roger Zugi, Ben Johnson. Thank you to them. All of them are absolute legends. Thank you very much if you made it this far into the video. I will catch you all very soon, and I hope you enjoyed it. All right, see ya.